The Last Run at Shiloh by Sebastian Reed. The ground trembled beneath Private James Connell's boots as the Confederate artillery thundered, shaking the Tennessee earth. He crouched low, his heart racing as the Union line faltered yet again. The air smelled of sulfur and wet soil, the scent of battle he had come to know too well in these last 2 years of war. The sun was still low in the sky, barely cutting through the morning fog that clung to the fields outside Shiloh Church. James wiped his brow with a trembling hand, his rifle clenched tight in his grip. Around him, his comrades struggled to maintain formation, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. This battle had been worse than the others. The dense forest and uneven ground made it hard to tell friend from foe. Screams and shouts mingled in the air, creating a chaotic symphony of terror. "We've got to hold the line," Sergeant Anderson's voice boomed, cutting through the noise. He stood like a rock in the storm, his weathered face showing no sign of panic. "Hold fast, men." James braced himself, clutching his rifle tighter. His thoughts raced back to the farm in Illinois, where his wife, Emma, waited for him. Her face had been the last thing on his mind before every battle, her letters the only thing that kept him sane in the madness of war. He had promised her he'd come home, no matter what. But standing here, surrounded by smoke and death, that promise felt more like a wish than a certainty. Suddenly the Confederate line broke through, their soldiers charging forward with bayonets fixed. James's heart lurched in his chest. There was no time to think, only to act. He raised his rifle, firing into the mass of gray uniforms bearing down on them. The recoil jarred his arm, but he barely noticed. All around him, Union soldiers were falling, some dead, others wounded, their cries rising into the already chaotic air. "Fall back," Sergeant Anderson finally shouted, his voice hoarse. "Fall back to the river." James didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, his legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. Behind him, the Confederate soldiers surged forward, cutting down anyone too slow to escape. The thick trees and underbrush made the retreat even more difficult, but James pressed on, his breath ragged in his throat. He dodged through the trees, his heart pounding in his ears, his rifle slung across his back. All around him, men were running, stumbling, trying to escape the relentless advance. He could hear the shouts of the enemy, closer now, the sound of boots crashing through the undergrowth. The Tennessee River was their only hope. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to regroup, to escape the slaughter. But the river was still a mile away, and James wasn't sure if he had enough strength left in his legs to make it. Ahead of him, he saw a fallen tree, its thick trunk lying across a narrow path. He leapt over it, his feet barely clearing the rough bark. His lungs burned with the effort, but he couldn't stop now. Stopping meant death. As he ran, James glanced to his left and saw a young soldier no older than 16 stumble and fall. The boy's face was pale, his wide eyes full of terror. Without thinking, James veered toward him, grabbing the boy by the arm and hauling him to his feet. "Come on," James shouted. "Don't stop." The boy nodded, his legs wobbly beneath him, but he ran. Together they pushed through the trees, the sounds of the battle fading slightly as they put distance between themselves and the Confederate line. James's mind raced. He had been in plenty of battles before, but none had felt as hopeless as this. The Confederates seemed endless, their soldiers pressing forward with terrifying determination. But he couldn't give up, not now, not after coming so far. "Keep going," James urged the boy, who was now breathing heavily, his steps faltering. Through the trees, the faint glimmer of the Tennessee River appeared, the water reflecting the gray sky above. Relief surged through James's chest, but it was short-lived. Just as they broke through the tree line, a gunshot rang out. James felt the boy's arm go limp in his grip. He turned, his heart sinking, to see the boy collapse to the ground, blood soaking through his uniform. The sight hit James like a punch to the gut, but there was no time to mourn. The Confederates were close, and he had to keep moving. "I'm sorry," James whispered before turning and sprinting toward the river. He could see the Union soldiers already crossing, some swimming, others boarding small boats. The water was cold and fast-moving, but it was their only escape. James didn't hesitate. He waded into the water, his breath catching as the cold hit him. The river tugged at his legs, threatening to sweep him downstream. But he fought against it, pushing toward the opposite bank. Behind him, more gunshots echoed through the trees. He didn't dare look back. The water rose to his waist, then his chest, but he kept moving, his legs burning from the effort. His rifle weighed him down, but he refused to let it go. It was the only thing that stood between him and death. The riverbank was just ahead now, only a few more yards. With one final surge of strength, James pulled himself through the water, his feet finally finding solid ground. He scrambled up the bank, gasping for breath, his body trembling from exhaustion. He collapsed onto the grass, his chest heaving. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own ragged breathing and the rush of the river behind him. The battle was still raging on the other side, but here on this bank there was a strange sense of peace. James rolled onto his back, staring up at the sky. He had made it. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. As he lay there, trying to catch his breath, he thought of Emma again. Her letters were always filled with hope, with dreams of the future they would build together once the war was over. For the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to believe in that future. He would go home. He would see her again. The sounds of the battle were fading now, the distant gunfire and shouts becoming mere whispers on the wind. The Union forces had pulled back, regrouping, and the Confederate advance had slowed. It wasn't a victory, not by any stretch, but it wasn't a complete defeat either. James sat up, his body aching from the day's ordeal, but his heart lighter than it had been in months. He had survived the Battle of Shiloh, and that was no small thing. Around him, other soldiers were gathering, their faces weary but alive. They, too, had made it through. In the distance, the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the river and the fields beyond. It was a beautiful sight, one James had never truly appreciated before the war. Now it seemed like a glimpse of the peace he longed for, the peace that would one day come. He would live to see it. As he rose to his feet, James took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool evening air. He wasn't done fighting. There were still battles ahead, still challenges to face, but for now he was alive. And that was enough. With one last glance at the river, he turned and joined his comrades, his thoughts already turning toward home, toward Emma, and the life that waited for him on the other side of this terrible war.